Can economic liberalization in the GCC pave the way for others in the Middle East to follow? We're here to find out. You're watching Inside AB. Jeremy, you edited and studied this in-depth piece by Lisa Amico in this week's issue of Arabian Business. Can you tell us a bit more about this and how it relates to the Gulf's corporate ownership model?
I can indeed. So Lisa Amico is the Managing Director of Govern, the Economic and Corporate Governance Centre. And she made an interesting comparison that 10 years on from the Arab Spring, or winter as it's probably more likely to be known by most people in this region, it's also 10 years on from the global financial crisis. And both of those events, although very different in nature, stem from the same thing in some sense, and that was wealth inequality.
Right, of course, yeah.
Now, 10 years later, here we are, and the World Inequality Report in December 2017 by Thomas Piketty, the famous economist, of course, who's written extensively on this subject, said that the Middle East is the most economically unequal region globally, with over 60% of wealth accumulated in the hands of 10% of the population.
That's incredible.
Yes. Now, corporate ownership, which of course is a big part of this, because who owns the means of production and all that, if you remember from your university days, it's not really been the subject of much soul searching in the countries that were affected by the Arab Spring. It's unfortunately been business as usual in that regard. But corporate ownership structures have actually been changing quite rapidly over the past couple of years in the Gulf. And it could serve as a model, Lisa hopes, that could redress the wealth gap across the rest of the region.
That report by Thomas Piketty is fantastic reading. Did it for an online endeavor that we had on Arabian Business.
Well, there we go.
But can you please recap what this Gulf model is? Why has it been successful?
Yeah, well, we should state that it's been very successful for the past 50 years. So it basically, large merchant families sort of took on the ownership of the big industries from the formation of the nations around 50 years ago.
Right.
And there was a nationalization program as well. So few remember, including I'd forgotten, that Saudi Aramco until the 1980s was owned by a conglomerate of American oil companies.
A vestige of the past.
So this worked very well, but foreign investors were restricted in ownership and they had to operate with these large merchant families through joint ventures or taking minority stakes.
Right.
Which obviously it worked because it guaranteed de facto rents to the government, but it had its limits.
Okay, so and how is that changing right now?
Well, these limits were that it prevented economic liberalization. Now, Dubai, which has long led the way, has had free zones for many years. It's got over 30, allowing full foreign ownership. But even with those in place, it still restricted businesses who wanted to operate within them but operating outside of the free zone. But again, that's changing as well now.
VAT is what has led to that happening. Or sorry, the oil prices.
Oil price, exactly.
Right.
Oil prices have had a massive impact around the Gulf, and it led them to rethink about where the future lies.
Right.
So they introduced VAT, as you said, and they also had quite a big impact on the corporate ownership.
Right.
So Bahrain was the first to allow full foreign ownership of onshore companies earlier this year, which was followed by the UAE and other Gulf countries. And both the UAE and other Gulf countries have announced schemes to grant longer residences and even permanent residences, really, to those who contribute to the economies. That's a huge, huge change. And Lisa Amico's keen to point out how this works in the bigger picture of liberalizing entire economies.
Now, for the investors, where this has become more prominent, is how this is being reflected in the change in capital markets, isn't it?
Of course. This all feeds into the whole economy. So there's been a fundamental restructuring of capital markets in the region where you had restrictions. Saudi Arabia's Tadawul, historically one of the most closed markets in the world, along with China, has progressively relaxed foreign investment restrictions. Of course, they've got Vision 2030, real efforts to reboot their economy. Individual listed companies in the UAE and other Gulf countries have also relaxed foreign ownership limits to benefit from the inclusion of exchanges in emerging market classifications.
Okay.
So that allows the inflow of foreign money.
Okay, so previously you said 60% of wealth in the hands of 10% of the population. With all this that's happening, this sort of liberalization, corporate ownership revolution, is there going to be a huge change that we should expect?
Well, I mean, it could be. I mean, taken piecemeal, these are all significant steps. But you look at the broader picture, Lisa describes this as a quiet corporate ownership revolution started by Bahrain and the UAE that's percolating through to other regions. We just mentioned Saudi in their 2030 vision. It creates access to ownership to a much wider pool of people. It encouraged foreign direct investment, obviously no longer leading local partners, and that makes the local businesses force them to be more competitive, and it also gives a recognition that a balance can be achieved for a lot more stakeholders in the economy. Now, this will be key to the next jump to all these economies in the region.
Right.
To sort of where do they go next in the vision thing that they've all got.
Hopefully something will trickle down towards them.
Well, yes, and this is the big thing. Of course, there's many Arabs from around the region that live in the Gulf in places like the UAE.
Right.
And they're going to see this and be a part of this. And hopefully that will percolate back to those other places within the region. So the hope is, and Lisa Amco certainly thinks so, that this will kind of percolate through to the rest of the region and that we're leading the way in liberalising the economies.
Jeremy Lawrence, thank you very much for helping simplify decades of development that have been taking place in the GCC. You've been watching Insight AB. Please stay tuned for the next edition of this series tomorrow at the same time, and remember to subscribe and comment below. Thank you for watching.